Woman forced to spend 30 years in isolation after ignoring a common hygiene practice. In the early 1900s, no one knew the dangerous truth about household cook Mary Malin, not even Mary herself. So when she placed her peaches and ice cream in front of her employees, they dug in, excited to once again taste her famous dish. What followed was a deadly mystery that took decades to fully unravel. Typhoid Mary turned out to be one of history's biggest social pariahs, and all because of a bowl of ice cream. Like most New Yorkers in the early 1900s, Mary Malon was an immigrant. She arrived in New York from Ireland in 1883, and she sought work doing the one thing she enjoyed, cooking. It wasn't long, though, before she started to notice a worrying trend. Weeks into every cooking job, the family she worked for would be struck by concerning symptoms. High fevers, splitting headaches, and terrible digestive woes that left them weak and exhausted. But Mary, curiously, never got sick. She hopped from house to house, which is how she started working for the Warren family. Days after they ate Mary's ice cream with peaches, it happened again. Each member of the family got sick. This time, however, Mary's employer didn't chalk it up to fate. Instead, Mr. Warren hired an investigator to find out why his family was suddenly suffering from typhoid, an uncommon disease for their part of Oyster Bay, Long Island. George Sopper, the investigator, slowly tracked the illness's path. In each household affected by typhoid, there was a common thread: an Irish cook. The problem was, as Sopper reached for the cook, he learned something alarming about her history. The mysterious Irish cook, it turned out, had a habit of skipping town. Mary Malin always left her employment as soon as a case of typhoid fever broke out, often conveniently forgetting to leave a forwarding address. By the time Sopper found her working in the household of another family, he realized something terrible about Mary. Sopper didn't yet have proof, but time would prove his hunch right. Mary Malin was the first asymptomatic carrier of typhoid to be identified in the United States. And it wasn't difficult to figure out how she spread it to countless people. Typhoid usually spreads because the carrier didn't take the right hygienic precautions, such as washing their hands after going to the bathroom. When a cook who touches the food of every household member neglects to wash their hands, the results are messy. And that's exactly what happened with Mary. Whether it was because of her own exhaustion as an overworked cook or plain carelessness, it's likely that Mary didn't wash her hands before making meals for her employers. A fatefully bad decision. Sopper deduced that Mary's employers couldn't have contracted typhoid from her hot meals because the high cooking temperatures would have killed the deadly bacteria. That's when they identified the real source: Mary's famous ice cream served with peaches. Sopper gave Mary the cold, hard facts. All 7 families she'd worked for had contracted typhoid fever, and 1 little girl died. Even with this knowledge, Mary refused to be tested for typhoid until the police showed up at her door. The cook was shoved into an ambulance and taken to Willard Parker Hospital. For the next 4 days, a restrained Mary was forced to provide urine and stool samples, which yielded scary results. She was filled with typhoid bacteria. While in the hospital, the dirty truth about Mary's typhoid was finally pieced together. She was probably born with typhoid and had unknowingly transmitted it to countless people throughout her life. There was no telling how many more people she'd infect. Unless the doctors were able to cut it off at the pass, that is. When Mary admitted that she hardly ever washed her hands, the authorities sentenced Mary to a short quarantine on North Brother Island. While in quarantine, Mary refused to have her gallbladder removed, even though it was probably the source of her typhoid. She also refused to stop working as a cook if and when she returned to the mainland. With that, Mary earned herself a very unflattering nickname. To the public, she became known as Typhoid Mary. Everyone was content to have her safely quarantined on North Brother Island, but Mary herself was miserable. She suffered from a nervous breakdown and complained that the doctors treated her like a guinea pig. All the while, Mary never believed that she was the reason all those people got sick. Despite this stubbornness, after 2 years on North Brother Island, The New York Commissioner of Health told Mary she could return to society on one condition. He forced Mary to sign an affidavit promising that she would never work as a cook again. She agreed and returned to New York City, where she successfully faded into the crowd. Until a few years later, a group of hospital workers suddenly fell ill. Various restaurants, hotels, and spas also reported outbreaks of typhoid. It didn't take long for Sopper to notice a common thread with each outbreak. An Irish cook, sometimes named Mary Brown or Mary Breshoff, always left a string of illness in her wake. In 1915, Sopper found Mary cooking for Sloan Hospital for Women, where 25 people were infected and 2 died of typhoid. With that, Mary was taken into custody and forced back to North Brother Island. This time, though, it was an extended stay. This extended stay ended up lasting Mary for the rest of her life. For 23 years, she lived alone in a cottage on North Brother Island, where she could cook all she wanted without hurting others. By the time she died in 1938, there were big changes on the mainland. By then, other asymptomatic typhoid carriers had been identified, making Mary's forced confinement the subject of controversy to this day. Some estimate that Mary may have caused, whether intentionally or not, 50 deaths, and to think it all started with a bowl of ice cream.